1967-68. What happened was, after I departed the morning news, with my health broken by going to bed at 10 or 11 and getting up at 3 for a couple of years, I was just working off the desk. I was working civil rights mainly, and politics. And I found politics fascinating. And so I really paid a lot of attention to it, and I also was covering both the '64 conventions and the '64 conventions. We're talking about getting up to '67, '68. And I had not covered Richard Nixon. And suddenly he was living in New York. He wasn't living in Washington. He wasn't living in California. And I was asked if I would be interested in covering Richard Nixon's putative campaign. And I said, absolutely. I had covered him in 1966 when he was flying around the country, and along with the people like Pat Buchanan, who was one of his speechwriters, and some of the John Sears and Ray Price, some of the people who would wind up with him eventually, it turned out, in the White House. And so I began to cover him in '67, and because I came to the chore with perhaps more open eyes, fresh eyes, than some of the older correspondents who had been traveling with him and didn't like him very much and had been disillusioned by him, he recognized in me somebody, a blackboard, I guess, that he felt he could write on. And so I covered him through the New Hampshire primary, following which he didn't, Len Garment, who was his law partner and now was helping to run his campaign, and a man by the name of Frank Shakespeare, who had been a CBS executive and had been detached to the Nixon campaign, asked me if I would like to be his press secretary. It came as a huge surprise to me because despite the fact that we hit it off as reporter and candidate, I didn't think that I was surprised. And I'd never worked in Washington and lived in Washington. I'd worked in Washington, obviously, but I had never lived in Washington and worked there. And I thought it would be a pretty interesting way to learn about that kind of thing. But I was talked to by Richard Hottelet, who was the UN correspondent for CBS News, and by Frank Stanton, who said, look, it took you a long time to get to be a CBS News correspondent. You finally made it in 1963. This is only 4 years later. If you go to Nixon and he loses, we're not absolutely certain that we can promise you that you will be back here as a CBS correspondent. I said, okay. And I wrote a letter to Mr. Nixon telling him that I didn't think I would be a very good, I remember the line was something to the effect that I wasn't going to be able to put a good face on bad facts, etc., etc. Thanked him and went on and continued to cover him until through the convention in which he was nominated. And then he expected me to go on with him. But by this time, in '68, I had already shot the first piece for the first 60 Minutes broadcast, which was to have cameras inside the Nixon Hotel down in Miami with his family watching him get nominated out at the convention hall. And so I remember very well standing there talking with him on camera and then later off camera. And he said to me, well, I'll see you in California next week, Mike. And I said, no, you won't, Mr. Nixon. I am, as I told you, I'm going to start a program called 60 Minutes. As a matter of fact, we were in your hotel suite watching you get nominated. And he said, well, he found it difficult to believe that I would turn down the opportunity to be the White House correspondent for CBS, because that was implicit. And he said, we're gonna go on some wonderful trips, Mike. And I had no idea what he was talking about. Of course, what he was talking about was China, Russia. And I made a lucky guess. I did the right thing.